keep it simple, stupid, right? So don't create complexity when it's not necessary. If you practice at 100%, you will play at 80%. So if you want to play at 100%, you have to practice at 150 or 120. Welcome everybody to the webinar. Today we'll be talking about system design interviews and how to master them. With me, I have Ken and George, both experienced managers, both in terms of QA, product, dev, from multiple different companies, including Apple, Amazon, a whole lot of startups. So Ken, George, thank you so much for joining me. All of the opinions, as you guys know, I'm both CEO of IncrediHire, and I'm also an SDM over on Amazon, IMDb. All of the opinions that I'm going to present here are mine, not Amazon's and not IMDb's, although I do draw a lot of my knowledge and a lot of my philosophy around system design from Amazon experience. I've also spent 15 years in Microsoft and about 4 years in Adobe. I have some companies to compare to. I've done a lot of these system design interviews. I'll give you my subjective opinions. Hopefully they're valuable. So with all of that, let's get started. All right, so the first question you might ask is, why system design interviews? What is the point? And to me, honestly, the biggest reason to do these is figuring out how candidates deal with ambiguity, right? As you can all imagine, there are going to be very few real-world situations where you're having to design Prime Video in 20 minutes and do it to an extent that it scales and everything completely makes sense and you understand all of the components involved. It's ridiculous, right? Like that never happens in the real world. What's the point? The point is, I want to see how you deal with highly ambiguous, large-scale questions and how methodical you are about drilling into those questions, right? So that's, for me, that's number one reason to do system design. Number two reason is, do you have the understanding of the fundamental concepts? And we'll cover that a little bit more. But if you're going after SaaS, do you understand what S3 is and what a load balancer is and how to scale a database, just generally, right? You don't have to go to a huge level of detail, but at a very high level, do you have those understandings? And then finally, do you have an understanding of fundamental CS principles? The notion of testability, notion of encapsulation, security, right? Like those kind of things. Do you have an understanding of all of that? So that's basically what we're trying to probe for when we do system design. And I will say that like different hiring managers might have slightly different expectations from what this interview will entail. But I will say also that if you cannot deal with ambiguity, if you don't have a methodical way of breaking down the problem, you will not succeed in a system design interview. So the next question that I commonly hear asked is, I'm a junior dev fresh out of college. Like, do I need to do system design? Do I need to design Prime Video in 20 minutes? So here's the thing. System design interviews are applicable at every level, but the way that they get asked and the expectations from the answers are going to differ depending on your level. For example, a senior engineer should be able to design Prime Video in roughly 20-25 minutes with roughly the kind of scale that's expected, having all the major components. Oops, my apologies. Is that better? All right. With roughly all the major components involved and be able to talk about how it's going to scale and all of that good stuff. That's expectation for a senior. A mid-level engineer, and I had a L5, in other words, mid-level system design interview just this morning with a candidate, right? And a mid-level engineer might not know a bunch of these concepts. For example, they might not be able to talk about authentication. They might not be able to explain the different types of load balancers. They might not be able to talk about database clustering and exactly how it works and all of that kind of stuff. And that's fine. Like, I'm not expecting that at L5. What I am expecting is a methodical breakdown of the problem and the general sort of sketch of how the different components will relate to each other. So that's basically the type of skill that an L5 should show. An L4, so in other words, a junior engineer, will be even further scoped down. So if I were to ask an L4 to design Prime Video, like I'm not expecting them necessarily to be able to talk about scale at all. I'm not expecting them to be able to talk about database clustering or that such a thing even exists. What I am expecting them to do is say, okay, I'm going to need some kind of storage for the video files. I'm going to need some kind of a database to store the metadata information. I'll probably need some kind of a backend. What kind of APIs am I going to need? Let's talk through those. And that's when we get to the design stage. I do expect them to be able to like drill into user stories, into the requirements, like who's going to be using this system, what kind of main scenarios should it support, right? Like even an L4 should be able to do that. It's not a question of experience. It's just a question of, do you have the engineering mindset? And so I would say that system design interviews are applicable at every level. It's just the scale is going to be different. So the best approach, and I'm not going to say I found it, actually, one of my friends found it. It's called PEDALS, to doing system design interviews. And basically, it's an acronym, a little bit artificial, I guess I would say, but it talks about the stages that you should go through when you're solving a system design question. The first stage is obviously process requirements, right? So drilling into ambiguity, understanding what the user stories are, understanding what the personas are, understanding what kind of scale you're facing, like all that, right? Second, estimate, right? So based on the scale that you figured out, like you need to estimate like approximately what kind of transactions per second, TPS, you're expecting, what kind of data storage requirements you might be facing, right? What kind of availability, latency, like all of that stuff that you should be thinking about. After that, like with that information, you start designing the service. And here, basically, you're just putting in rough sketches of what the system is going to be like. You're not thinking about scaling the system yet. You're just talking about the major blocks, right? Then you go and articulate, which is silly. They could have just said create the data model, but then it wouldn't be PEDALS. Basically, articulate the data model. So what are you going to be storing in the database? How are they like, how is that data going to be structured, et cetera, et cetera. Then you list out, this one I think is also a little bit artificial. You could say that it happens at the design stage, but basically you list out what are the major components. And finally, you talk about scale, right? So this is the stage at which you might add in load balancers. You might start talking about the database clustering and so forth. Now, the one thing and the biggest fail that I see over and over again is people do not realize that in a typical 60-minute interview, you are going to get maybe 25 to 30 minutes to be able to answer the system design question, right? Because if you talk about Amazon interviews, right, what winds up happening is each interviewer in an Amazon 60-minute interview has two leadership principles that they have to probe into, and then either a coding or a system design question. So for me, this morning, for example, right, like I had to probe into earn trust and into have backbone, disagree, and commit. Those are two of the Amazon leadership principles. And so what I need to do is I need to ask a bunch of questions to probe into those things, and that takes time. So what I roughly do is I separate my interview first, like 3 to 5 minutes, just breaking the ice, right? Just general kind of conversation. Hey, here's who I am. Here's what we're going to do today, blah, blah, blah. So first 5 minutes is essentially break the ice. Second, like 20, 25 minutes is this behavioral question stuff, right? So that means that at best, you have 30 minutes at the tail end of the interview to be able to answer system design. But I also want to leave some room for you to ask questions too, right? So like today, for example, I left 10 minutes for the candidate. I actually ended my leadership principle questions at 25 after. So she had approximately 30 or 28 minutes or so to be able to answer the system design question. So that means that you have to be pretty darn fast. Because if we get to the end of the system design and you don't have anything on the drawing surface on the screen, right? I don't have enough data to be able to support a hire decision. And if I don't have the data to support a hire, that's a no hire automatically, right? Because the only way that we provide a hire decision is if we are certain that this person is going to raise the bar. The question that is asked in Amazon, is this candidate better than 50% of your team? That's a high freaking bar, right? So every time each candidate has to show that they're better than 50% of the team. So if you don't have stuff on the board at the end of these 25 minutes, that's not going to be a hire. So that's why this is how I structure the timeline of a system design, right? So you should spend no more than 5 minutes gathering requirements, no more than about 2 minutes with estimation, right? This is a place where I see people fail. They start going into too much detail with estimation. They start trying to compute the exact numbers. That's not necessary. All you need to know is like for TPS, for example, transactions per second, are you talking about like tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, right? That's all you need to know. For scale, are you talking gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, right? So you don't need to know the exact number. All you need to know is the general scale you're dealing with. That shouldn't take much time. The majority of your answer is going to be in design, right? So this is where you're spending time on actually designing your system, sketching out all the components. And this is where you're drawing all that stuff. And I'll also say this is a common fail that I see. All of the Amazon interviews, at least, and I imagine like all of them at this point, use some kind of a drawing tool. So Amazon uses InVision. I've seen Excalidraw be used. We'll be using Excalidraw today for our mocks. But all the Amazon or all the interviewers use some kind of a online drawing system. If you're not familiar with it, if you're struggling to find where the rectangle tool is, if you're struggling to find how to type text, all of that, you're just wasting your time on like dealing with the tool instead of actually putting stuff on the board. And remember, you only have about 10 minutes to draw this whole thing. So my strong recommendation is whatever tool you're going to be using, ask your recruiter what tool will be used, and then get really familiar with the shortcuts. For example, like InVision, if you want to do a rectangle, you type R. That switches you to the rectangle tool. You want to do text, you type T. That switches you to the text tool, and so on. So get familiar with the shortcuts, be able to sketch quickly. It's a skill into itself, but it will really pay off when you're not struggling to resize rectangles and do all that stuff during the interview. Finally, around 5 minutes for data model, no big deal. And then about 3 minutes for scale. So this is 25 minutes. This gives your interviewer around 5 minutes to ask follow-up questions, drill in, whatever, if they want to. So that's essentially what the timeline looks like. Now, for the next section, this being Halloween and all, I know a lot of people talk about how to succeed in a system design interview. I'm going to talk about how to fail and or what failure looks like, and maybe a couple suggestions about how to avoid it. Essentially, in Amazon, for example, at the end of every interview, there is a tool that basically we put our feedback in. And this tool shows like what success looks like, what failure looks like. So they have specific rubrics. I've roughly taken those and I've translated them into this petals model. And this is what you're going to see in this next set of slides. So take these seriously. These are actually like the actual conditions that will cause a fail scenario. So first, the produce requirements failure, right? Fails to validate given functional requirements, right? So essentially fails to drill into the problem and understand what exactly is needed. A very common side effect of this that I see over and over again is makes unvalidated assumptions. So assumes that the problem should be functioning, and this happened this morning actually too to some extent, assumes that it should be functioning in a certain way, starts designing based off those assumptions. And then like when I interrupt and I say, actually, that just completely sets the candidate back, right? All of this nice, pretty design that they've been thinking about is no longer valid because their assumption was incorrect. And the thing is, this is really important from a job perspective, right? This is a huge red flag generally, because if I have an employee and they pick up a task and they make an assumption about if the task is ambiguous, which often happens, as you guys know, and they assume that it should function a certain way and spend a couple of days writing code just to find out that assumption was bad, that's a couple of days writing code wasted. So if the candidate is showing me that they jump to conclusions, they're making assumptions, that's going to be a huge red flag. So make sure that you really drill into requirements and you really understand things and that you're not assuming. Because this is a fail even before you started doing design. Misses basic customer use cases, right? So when we'll talk about how to approach producing requirements in a second, this is together with assumptions and requirements. And then finally, overlooks important NFRs, non-functional requirements, right? For example, what should be the system availability? What should be the system latency, right? Like stuff like that. So how do you actually do this correctly? You start with personas. The very first question you should be asking when asked a system design question is who are going to be the people using it, right? If we take Prime Video, you could say the primary user is going to be the viewers of the video, the subscribers. Secondary user is going to be movie studios who want to sell videos to Prime Video, etc., etc. So you start with that. Given that, you trace the key user stories, right? So as a persona, as a Prime Video subscriber, I want to find the movie and then whatever. So that business reason would be like, so that I can watch what I want, for example. You don't have to do this so that. It's a typical format to write user stories. For system design, you can omit that part. You mainly just want to focus on, as a Prime Video subscriber, I want to find the movie I want to watch. Or as a Prime Video subscriber, I want to watch a movie, or whatever it is, right? So you drill in and you generate a list of those user stories covering the personas that the interviewer wants you to cover. So that should be your step number one. And then as you are generating them, you're writing them down, or you're potentially even starting to sketch like initial, okay, I know I'm going to need like a backend service to support this. So let me just put a quick square on that, a quick square on my screen. This is going to be my backend service. I'll just, so I have some grounding. Make sense so far? All right. Second failure, estimation failure, right? So one is fails to identify key scaling considerations. So that's around what kind of latency are we expecting? What kind of data storage are we expecting? What kind of TPS are we expecting? That kind of thing. Getting too bogged down in estimation, right? I've seen multiple candidates do this. Like they start trying to compute the exact numbers, and one, it wastes time and actually like denies them a chance to complete the problem. So don't do that. And then finally, and I see this quite often, is they start optimizing. Even before understanding the full problem, understanding the full scaling consideration, they start trying to optimize. That's a red flag as well, right? Like on the job, if that happened, that would be a problem, right? As you guys know. So how do you approach this? You have these software engineering friends. I call them illities. And I could come up with a few of those illities myself, but I decided, hey, I'm going to ask ChatGPT, what are illities? Or what other illities can you think about? Not all of these are illities, like performance, for example, but you guys can see there is a big list. And this list is not even complete. The most important illities are scalability, right? So you have to think about how big does your system need to scale? And that's where the estimation part came in, where you figured out what your scale is going to be, right? Availability, how available should your system be? Is this a 3 nines, 4 nines situation? That kind of thing, right? How testable, or how to make this system testable as you start design. This is something you should be thinking about. How am I going to test the individual components of the system? Am I going to require only end-to-end testing? Because you guys all know that's super flaky and unpleasant, right? Maintainability, right? How is the system going to be maintained? Observability and security, right? So those are things that you really should be thinking about when you're doing your estimation and requirements gathering, right? Before you ever get into design, you need to understand what the requirements around those areas are. So now design failures, right? So breaking down a problem into functional components, that's obvious. That's just, table stakes. Coming up with a solution that doesn't meet the requirements, right? Obvious again. Doesn't consider the impact on other components, right? So making design choices to one component that's going to destabilize the system in general. Significant or reasonably avoidable complexity, right? So solutions that are needlessly complex. Doesn't identify trade-off opportunities. So this happens frequently. It's going to be like, it's going to be basically a choice of we could do this, we could do that. And an interviewer will ask, or will often ask, what are the trade-offs? And sometimes the candidate will not be able to answer. Or sometimes the candidate will say, I think we should do X because that feels right. No, right? You should be able to come up with specific reasons for why you want to do a specific thing. Common design stage fails that I've seen, right? And these are a little bit more basic, right? So SQL versus NoSQL. You should be able to articulate like why you're going with one choice or the other choice. right? Not having just a basic toolbox. And these are just some things that came to my mind. I'm sure there are more. So knowing how to use S3 and what it's used for, knowing when load balancers are used for, knowing what a queuing service is used for and what kind of effect it'll have on your system and like when to put it in. Knowing some basic authentication mechanisms like OAuth, for example, and just being able to briefly explain it. Knowing how to scale databases depending on your storage requirements and depending on your transaction TPS requirements, like how does it scale? And then finally, like not having the design actually on the board at the end of the interview. If there is nothing on the board at the end of the interview, that's going to be a problem. So you want to make sure you're putting those things in as you design. So moving on, talking about the data model, articulating the data model. Again, can't produce a reasonable data model to support the requirements, obviously, right? Or the data model is needlessly complex or inefficient. This actually happens more often, right? So people start creating unnecessary complexity. My suggestion for that is KISS, right? I think most of you guys know this acronym for software engineering. Keep it simple, stupid, right? So don't create complexity when it's not necessary. Keep it simple. And then finally, scaling, right? Solution, not being able to scale the solution to the problem requirements, right? Like how does the solution work if there is a sudden spike in TPS in usage, right? Or creating avoidable maintenance challenges, right? Creating a component that if it comes down is going to bring down the entire system, right? Single point of failure, or not being able to articulate how to mitigate availability risks, right? So those are the kind of things that you should be thinking about. And then finally, when you're scaling, as I mentioned, you're targeting order of magnitude, right? You're not targeting specific numbers. You're just thinking about, okay, I'm going to have to deal in gigabytes. Therefore, I'm going to use this versus I'm going to deal with in petabytes. Therefore, no, I'm going to use something else. I will say, and I forgot to put this slide in, but a resource that I found very helpful for just basically getting practice with system designs is AlgoExpert. So there is a site called AlgoExpert AI. They have a big library of system design components and also system design questions. So I would recommend, if you haven't seen it already, go there and really take some time, learn. That's what I used when I interviewed. I found it to be super, super helpful. Recognizing that we are getting to our time, a few more slides. All of this stuff is great in theory, right? I'm sure you've all, or at least I hope that you've all listened to me and you go, yep, that all makes sense. Yep, absolutely. I will not do that. I'm not going to prematurely optimize. Nope, absolutely not. But when it comes time to actually do the interview, what I've often seen is like our best intentions get left in the stress of the moment. And we just forget things. My dad, who is a concert pianist, used to have this saying that if you practice at 100%, you will play at 80%. So if you want to play at 100%, you have to practice at 150 or 120, meaning you practice until you no longer have to spend a huge amount of time at the basics and you can focus on the higher level stuff. There is no substitute for practice. That's also why I'm stressing that, guys, somebody please volunteer if you haven't already. It is really worth it. So that said, we at IncrediHire also came up with a program to help you guys with this. And basically what that program is, you're getting coaching from me, George, and Ken, some individual coaching, also some group coaching. You work on a real world project. You practice interviews around 3 times a week. So essentially what happens is we recruit a cohort of students. We put them into a real team, basically managing them just as we would manage our real Mang teams. But additionally, we also give them interview practice and stuff like that. We work on a SaaS project together. So they're getting practice. They're also they're learning from us about processes that we have learned during our time managing and during our time in Mang. We evaluate them during this time based on a criteria that I call OCA, which is basically ownership, competence, collaboration, and attitude. At the end of the cohort, we create individualized evaluation documents for the students that basically talk about things they've done, how they have presented their OCA characteristics. And those are documents that we send to our network of hiring partners. So essentially, from a hiring manager perspective, instead of just getting a recruiter who is like just sending warm bodies, they're getting candidates with evaluations, with detailed evaluations, with artifacts. So all the code that you produce, all the design docs that you write, all that stuff is available to your potential companies, right? So they can evaluate you. They can evaluate you in detail around. They're not just getting an unknown. They're getting somebody who they can trust more from the get-go. They'll still interview you, but at least you're not starting from scratch. This has been especially valuable for more junior level candidates who don't have as much experience, that for hiring managers, typically it's more of a chance. Yeah, I'll talk about that. Sorry, I'm seeing questions roll by, which is why I'm getting distracted. So I'm going to stop looking at the chat. But yeah, I'll talk about how long the course is and all that. And then finally, when you get hired, we offer 90 days post-hire career mentoring, right? So we help you ramp up on the job. We give you coaching about how to set the right filters with your potential employers. And we can talk about filters for quite a while, but basically how to set yourself up for success, how to ramp up quickly. What we ask is roughly a 6-week commitment. So we've been discussing this internally, and what the way that we are thinking about this is for super rockstar candidates, and we had this in our last cohort, it becomes obvious when somebody is a rockstar within 2 to 3 weeks. So we'll take like a minimum of 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks, for those who are clearly qualified and clearly ready to interview, we will start sending their profiles to our hiring partners. Some folks might take longer. Some folks might take longer than 6 weeks, right? They just need a little bit more time to get better at interviewing or whatever it is. And in that case, they can stay in the cohort for longer. So that's basically, but it'll average out to around 6 weeks. We ask for a growth mindset. There will be a lot of learning and a lot of new practices that you guys might not be used for. And then, or not used to. And then there is a $1,500 flat fee, although, and I'll talk about this shortly, we are having a sale just for today for joining this webinar that I'll show you guys. In terms of minimum requirements to succeed, so we are not taking folks who don't know software engineering, right? The idea is this is like bootcamp grads or college grads or people with experience who know how to code, right? Who know basic system design and system architecture, know the basic tools that are typically used in software engineering, and have a passion for learning and growing, right? So we are not taking folks from zero. This is more of an upskill type course than a bootcamp type course. The application process is fairly simple. So you go to incredihire.com, you can submit an application there. You'll schedule a meeting. If you're an SDE, you'll schedule a meeting with me. If you're an SDET, with George, and if you're a PM, with Ken. At the end of that meeting, if we decide the program is the right program for you, we'll send you an offline assessment. So there'll be a coding assessment. If you pass the assessment, then you're admitted. And actually, our next cohort is scheduled to start on Monday. And that is the presentation.